Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss metabolic states of the body. Before we get started, I should say that you're going to notice that we are in chapter 24, and we're going to start with section 5 here because the first 4 sections of this chapter are going to cover and review some basic metabolism that we already talked about in chapter 1, and then also there will be several sections dedicated to glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, fermentation, components of cellular respiration and cellular metabolism that we had a whole lecture dedicated to in chapter 3. So if you have any questions about those as you read through chapter 24, I would encourage you to go to that particular lecture video in chapter 3. Okay, so one of the fundamental realities for all living things, not just humans, is that we need energy to survive. We need energy to power our metabolic reactions and allow us to do all the sorts of active processes that we go about throughout our day. So we also know from a chapter 1 lecture that one of the fundamental needs of the human body is food. We need nutrients. So what food provides for us are energy-rich molecules that can be broken down via catabolism, and through cellular respiration, we can extract the energy from those high-energy food molecules, and we can package that energy into the molecular bonds of ATP, and then that ATP can be hydrolyzed at a later time, and that energy that gets released from there can be used to power our anabolic processes like protein synthesis and muscle contraction. So when we start talking about metabolic states, we are talking about the different types of situations the body finds itself in, depending on how recently has it been since we have eaten food. And this is going to be something that we kind of explore when we get into chapter 17 on the endocrine system. So we're not really going to get into it in this chapter, but we are going to find that a lot of metabolic processes in the body are regulated by the endocrine system and hormones. Okay, so when you eat food, whether it's a snack or a full-on meal, you are feeding energy-rich compounds like glucose or fatty acids or proteins into your digestive system. So what your digestive system does is break those larger molecules down like proteins and polysaccharides and very large lipid molecules like triglycerides. We are breaking those large molecules down via hydrolysis. We've talked about that type of chemical reaction before. The hydrolysis of these molecules breaks these very large molecules down into much simpler molecules, very small molecules like glucose, a monosaccharide, single amino acids like valine or glycine or arginine, fatty acids, which are not exactly small, but are much more manageable than a full-blown triglyceride. So what the body is preparing for at that point, once we digest the food and absorb that food across the intestinal epithelia and into the bloodstream, the body has to get ready because there is a lot more involved in dealing with digesting and processing a meal than you might expect. So the body must be prepared for the act of extracting and using the energy that is in that food. And as such, the body, as complex as metabolism is, as you might think, the body has a number of different states of function depending on where in the process we are. Did we just eat a big meal, or has it been 5 or 6 hours since we've eaten anything? So we are going to explore different metabolic states here today. So as we've seen already, there are many tissues in the body that actually require a constant, unceasing supply of energy, meaning that these are tissues that literally cannot ever go without energy. They always are needing to be fed nutrient molecules. So we've talked about things like the brain, which needs to be fed constantly. The cardiac muscle of the heart needs to be fed constantly. So those are two major examples of tissues and organs that have to constantly be supplied with nutrition so that they can generate enough ATP energy in order to power their cellular processes. But the reality is that much as we might like to, we are not eating constantly. So the question then becomes, how are these tissues constantly supplied with energy if we are not eating constantly? So with that, we're going to describe the first metabolic state. This is either called, depending on where you're looking, this is either called the fed state or the absorptive state. So this state is what your body is going to enter into once you have finished a meal. So you have finished a meal, you have eaten food, that food is being digested, the nutrients are being absorbed through the intestinal epithelia into your bloodstream, and the bloodstream is going to deliver these nutrient molecules to the tissues and organs and cells throughout your body that need those nutrients for making energy. So your body's focus in this particular metabolic state. And remember, the reason why we have to have a whole body metabolic state is because when you're talking about like utilizing the food that you eat, this is not a problem just for the digestive system. This is also a problem for the cardiovascular system. It's a problem for the nervous system. It's a problem for the endocrine system. It's a problem, well, not really a problem, but it is an issue that has to be collectively solved by multiple organ systems all at once. So that's why we have to have this whole body metabolic state so that every single one of those collaborating organ systems can all be on the same page. So the whole body's focus here in the fed state or the absorptive state is going to be on food digestion, that goes without saying, nutrient absorption, again, that goes without saying, and energy storage, okay? So yes, we do eat food for the sake of feeding our needy tissues, but we're not usually going to find ourselves in such a starved state that we need to eat food and then all of that food just immediately gets used up. It's not like we're throwing dry newspaper onto a burning furnace, right? So most of the food that we eat is going to create what we might call an energy excess. It's really more food than our body needs right at this very given moment. But our body is actually very good at planning for the future, so most of the food that we digest, absorb, and then start circulating around, most of those food molecules are going to be stored up for later, okay? So that's what we mean by energy storage. So we're talking about storing sugars as glycogen in your liver and skeletal muscle. We're talking about storing excess fat as fat tissue in your body. So the focus, the overall focus here is going to be on anabolism rather than catabolism. Now, of course, catabolism is going to be an important part of that food digestion process, but once you start talking about kind of the after you've absorbed the food into your bloodstream, from then on, you're going to be focusing on anabolism. How do we take these small food molecules like glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, and then build them up into something bigger like glycogen or fat and save it for later? Okay, so that's what we mean when we say we're going to kind of be focusing on anabolism here. Okay, so you can see from this picture from your book that first, any food that you have digested and absorbed is going to enter the bloodstream from the intestines because, don't forget, the intestines have a very thin layer of epithelia that your food molecules have to be actively transported across. We talked about that in a previous video. So, for example, if you're talking about eating food that is rich in all sorts of nutrients, your bloodstream is going to become rich in things like glucose, which is a carbohydrate, lipids, amino acids. So you can see all of these different things in your bloodstream, and those nutrients are going to be circulated throughout the cardiovascular system, and those nutrients should be absorbed by tissues all throughout the body, whether it's muscle tissue, liver tissue, or whatever. Okay, so as we see here, these nutrient molecules that have been absorbed through the intestinal epithelia hit the bloodstream, and from here on, what happens to these nutrients is going to be largely determined by different hormones. So our focus here is mostly going to be on the glucose here, okay? So we know that glucose levels in the blood are something that needs to be carefully regulated through homeostasis. So this is actually regulated through a pair of hormones that we will briefly talk about here, but we'll talk about in greater detail when we get to chapter 17 on the endocrine system. So if we're focusing on glucose here, we are going to need some collaboration here between the digestive system and the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is going to help out by having the pancreas secrete the hormone insulin, which I am sure you have heard of before. So insulin is released from the pancreas, and this insulin is going to act as a signal that tells the cells of the body that we need to be absorbing this glucose from the blood, okay? So after you eat a meal, your blood sugar is going to go up, which is not exactly a desirable thing. We don't want it to get too high. So what insulin is going to do here is instruct cells of the body like liver cells, muscle cells, and fat cells to absorb this glucose from the blood and internalize it. So what we want is we want this glucose to exit the bloodstream and go inside the cells of the liver, go inside the cells of the skeletal muscle, go inside the cells of adipose tissue. So in doing so, that removes that excess glucose from the bloodstream, gets the blood sugar levels back down into that normal range that we like, and all the while, these cells now that have absorbed the glucose, they can now take this glucose and assimilate it into something that can be stored long term. In the liver and skeletal muscle, that glucose will be anabolized into the much larger glycogen, which can be saved for later. And in adipose tissue, several complex metabolic processes, including gluconeogenesis, which we've talked about before, can help to transform that glucose into fatty acids, which can then be stored up as fat in these adipose cells. Okay, so if we want to kind of focus a little further on these body cells that have absorbed the glucose, I just mentioned that liver and muscle cells use the absorbed glucose for glycogen synthesis, and you'll recall hopefully that glycogen is just a large polysaccharide made of repeating glucose subunits. So you can just kind of think of it as a extra big chain of glucose molecules that are stored inside the cells of the liver and inside the cells of skeletal muscle. Muscle cells, in addition to focusing on absorbing glucose, will also absorb amino acids to allow them to synthesize new proteins that are necessary for continued muscle contraction, such as actin and myosin. And eventually, when we get to chapter 10 on muscle physiology, we will learn all about what these proteins actin and myosin do as far as muscle contraction goes. So look forward to hearing about that. And then, of course, adipose tissue not only absorbs glucose, which can then, of course, through gluconeogenesis be transformed into fat that can be stored up. Adipose tissue is also instructed to absorb lipids from the blood, which are carried around by structures called chylomicrons. And those fats can then be stored long term. You don't have to turn sugar into fat. You can just absorb fat as well. Okay, so before we get to the second metabolic state, I want to present kind of a case study, something for you to think about. So hopefully you've heard of either the Atkins diet, which was very popular in the early 2000s, kind of the early 21st century, or the keto diet, which is sort of the same philosophy as far as diets go, just more recently. So hopefully you've heard of one of these diets, and hopefully you can, even if you haven't really looked into it very much, you know that, okay, these are diets that focus very much on eliminating as many carbohydrates from your diet as possible. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to explore the underlying philosophy of these diets. Why should these diets work? Why should you lose weight and be healthier by eliminating carbohydrates from your diet? Okay, so we know that when glucose gets high in the blood, the natural response is that the pancreas is going to secrete insulin. So what insulin does, and again, we'll explore more of this in chapter 17, insulin will default the body into storing fat rather than utilizing it. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. Storing fat rather than utilizing it. What does utilizing fat look like? Well, utilizing fat would involve taking triglycerides and other fat-related molecules, hydrolyzing them into individual fatty acids, and then breaking down those fatty acids through the beta oxidation process to produce ATP. Okay, that's what utilizing fat would look like. And we know, or at least we've mentioned in a previous video, that a single fat molecule, a single fatty acid molecule, in fact, has the capability to produce a lot more ATP, a lot more energy than a single molecule of glucose. Okay, so it would be fair to say, if the goal of the body is to produce as much energy as possible, it would probably be more efficient to use fat for energy than it would for glucose. But here's the problem here. When we eat food, specifically when glucose levels get high in the blood, so when we're eating something that has carbohydrates in it, that causes our glucose levels to go up, and that causes our pancreas to secrete insulin. And what we're saying here is that when insulin is doing its job, it makes it very hard to burn fat. It makes it very hard to use that fat for energy. So what you're doing when you eat food that is high in carbohydrates, it's that you're using the carbohydrates for energy, and then any fats that are there as well get stored up in your midsection as fat tissue rather than being used for the great amount of energy that they have. So that's kind of a problem, right? So therefore, we can conclude that if a person's diet is high in both carbohydrates and fats, that person is going to be using the carbohydrates for energy, and then any excess carbohydrates and then 100% of the fats that they're eating are going to be stored in that adipose tissue. So the result there is undesirable weight gain, especially around kind of that midsection, right? Okay, so how would one of these diets work? So I mentioned these diets prioritize very low intake of carbohydrates. So if a person abstains from most carbohydrates and has a diet that is much higher in proteins and fats and doesn't eat very many carbohydrates, then that should create a situation where the pancreas does not really secrete insulin very much. So if insulin is not present, we are not defaulting the body into storing fat. We are actually creating a situation where that fat can be used and burned off. So that's the idea. But of course, I am not advocating necessarily for these diets. Every person is unique in their own situation, what their body looks like, what it feels like, what their actual metabolism is like, what their underlying genetics is like. So the disclaimer I'm providing here is that every diet has benefits and drawbacks. So what I just described here may sound really, really, really good, but if you're actually thinking about starting a brand new diet, especially one as intense as one of these, I would not advise jumping right into it without having the chance to talk to a doctor or a medical professional first. Okay, so let's move on to the other metabolic state, other than the fed state or the absorptive state. So this next one is called the fasting or post-absorptive state. So you might imagine this is the state you go into when it has been a while since you have eaten food. So you don't currently have really any food in your digestive system. Your body is basically just running on nutrients that are already in your bloodstream. And as we will see here, your body is going to be focusing on drawing on those energy stores that we built up during the fed state. So we're going to take those stored nutrients like glycogen and fat, and during the fasting or post-absorptive state, we are going to hydrolyze glycogen into glucose, fat into fatty acids, and we are going to utilize those molecules to help to maintain nutrient delivery to tissues in the absence of new food entering into our system. Don't forget, we have tissues and organs in our body, like the brain and like the heart, that have this constant, unceasing requirement for energy. So if we're not eating food, if it's been 8 hours since we've eaten, we still need to supply those cells and those tissues and those organs with nutrient molecules. So if we're not eating anything, those nutrients have to come from somewhere. So it makes as much sense as anything as to burn fat or burn through our glycogen stores to make up that shortcoming. Okay, so in the fasted state, as you can imagine, insulin levels are going to decline because you have less glucose in your bloodstream. So the lack of insulin is, as we mentioned before, this will allow for the utilization of fat as an energy source. So this will actually allow us to burn through our fat stores. And then glucagon, this is not glycogen, this is glucagon. So just kind of a quick little tip. Glucose, glycogen, and glucagon are three words that are all going to sound similar, but they are all completely different things. Glucagon is another hormone that is secreted by the pancreas, and the pancreas secretes glucagon when blood sugar levels start to fall, such as when it's been a while since you've eaten in the fasted state. So what glucagon will do is it will act as a signal to the liver, the muscle, and the fat tissue to break down glycogen, to break down fat, in order to bring those glucose levels back up. So you might remember that the brain in particular has a very strict requirement for glucose for its energy source. So we always have to have a certain amount of glucose in the bloodstream to make sure that we're able to feed the brain. So glucagon is a big part of making sure that we always keep our blood glucose levels sufficiently high to feed the brain. Like I just said, blood glucose cannot be permitted to fall below about 70 milligrams per deciliter, since it is the required energy source of the brain. So if we kind of look at some of the different metabolic processes that are going on here during the fasted or post-absorptive state, as you can imagine, the liver, which usually stores up glycogen, is going to be breaking down that glycogen and exporting some of that glucose back into the bloodstream. That'll bring blood glucose back up. Same thing kind of goes with skeletal muscle, which also stores up glycogen, so we can break down that glycogen. Usually in those cases, that glycogen can be released, but more often than not, it's actually going to be directly utilized by the skeletal muscle itself. If absolutely necessary, so this would be less of a fasted state and more of a starvation state, we can break down some of the protein in muscle and export those amino acids out if we absolutely have to, but we would rather not do that. And then in the fat tissue over here, we can break down those triglycerides into fatty acids, which can then be exported into the bloodstream as well and delivered via chylomicrons to other tissues throughout the body. So in the fasted or post-absorptive state, our focus here is no longer going to be on anabolism like it was in the fed state. It is rather going to be on catabolism. So we are going to use glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen, and then also gluconeogenesis to make sure that even in the fasted state, blood glucose stays within that 70 to 110 milligram per deciliter range. You don't want your blood glucose to fall outside that normal range. You don't want it to fall too low, because then that's going to mean that your brain is not getting enough energy, and you don't want it to get too high for reasons that we'll talk about another time. Okay, so this is not technically a distinct metabolic state. It's more of a extreme extension of the post-absorptive state. But starvation describes a situation in which the body has gone without food for a very long, extended period of time, and we have completely blown through our glycogen stores, okay? So glycogen is meant to be energy storage in the short term. Fat is going to be more of a long-term storage facility. So fat can certainly be burned if you're like going out of your way to try to lose weight or something like that, but in an evolutionary sense, in a true body function sense, we're actually not really meant to burn through the fat unless we are literally starving, okay? So as a consequence, because we no longer have that glycogen to tap into, the longer you go without food, the more your blood glucose is going to start to drop. So those drops in blood glucose are going to start being unavoidable. So in the starved state, the body is going to prioritize a couple of things. Number one, most important thing to prioritize, we have to feed the brain. As we mentioned, glucose is the number one most highly preferred form of nutrition for the brain, but in a pinch, the brain can use what are called ketone bodies. Ketone bodies are a type of organic molecule that are produced from the breakdown of fat through beta oxidation. So if we no longer have glycogen to tap into and we're having to burn fat for energy, then those released ketone bodies can actually be used by the brain for energy. But again, this is very much not ideal. Metabolically speaking, cells throughout the body are going to basically stop going through cellular respiration. So we are going to put a stop to glycolysis, which is your number one glucose-consuming metabolic process in the whole metabolic universe. So we are going to stop glycolysis, we're going to stop cellular respiration to preserve what little glucose we still have, to make sure that we can still get glucose delivered to our much more glucose-dependent tissues like the brain. Secondly, the body is going to prioritize preserving the integrity of protein synthesis. Now, you know, for protein synthesis, we need amino acids. Individual amino acids are assembled together in an anabolic process to create a long polypeptide that is then folded into functional proteins. And because proteins do all the important heavy lifting for all of our different cellular processes in the whole physiology universe, we cannot risk anything that would get in the way of synthesizing new proteins, because obviously that's very important. So the body is going to very much prioritize the breakdown of fatty acids for energy rather than trying to break down proteins. You get into a very, very, very dangerous game when the body gets so desperate for energy that it starts breaking down proteins. That is a very bad situation to find yourself in. So, as it says down here, once fat is totally depleted from the body, that's going to be when the body starts breaking down protein and scavenge that for energy, and that's going to be where the terminal end-of-life effects of starvation are going to start manifesting themselves. That's going to be where truly vital physiological functions start to become compromised. Okay, that's going to do it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I would suggest you look into, and then a couple of checking your understanding questions to think about. Number one, in which metabolic states do insulin and glucagon predominate? And don't forget, it's insulin for one and glucagon for the other, so you're going to want to make sure you can keep that straight. Number two, how do insulin and glucagon regulate the way energy is handled in the body? And as you might expect, they do this in very different ways. And number three, why is it so important to keep blood glucose levels up even if non-glucose fuel sources exist? Something we mentioned several times here. Okay, that's going to do it. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the comments section or send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you next time. So long.